I'm Mark Tessier-Levine, president of the Rockefeller University, and it's my pleasure to host this evening's program, which is co-sponsored by the Parents in Science and the Women in Science initiatives here at the university. For those of you who are new to Rockefeller, I'd like to give you just a very brief overview. Rockefeller is truly an extraordinary place. Founded in 1901, the university is devoted to research and graduate education in the biomedical and related natural sciences. It's home to some of the world's leading investigators, and its research hospital, which was established in 1910, has been the site of many historic breakthroughs, including the discovery that genes are made of DNA. The university has an unparalleled record of achievement. Our faculty has had more Nobel laureates in medicine and chemistry than any other institution in the world, 24 to be exact, and 5 in the past 15 years. If Rockefeller University were a country, it would rank 4th in Nobel Prizes in medicine and chemistry after the US, the UK, and Germany. Now, both Women in Science and Parents in Science were born out of Rockefeller's longstanding commitment to educating the lay public about basic and clinical research. Women in Science programs focus on the latest scientific discoveries related to women's health, while also showcasing talented women scientists. Parents in Science talks aim to inform parents about all aspects of child health and development, addressing topics about the care and nurturing of children from infancy through adolescence. As many of you know, our inaugural Parents in Science Celebrating Science benefit was scheduled for November 7th, but because of the snowstorm that followed the hurricane, we had to postpone the benefit. It's been rescheduled now for Wednesday, February 13th at 6:30 p.m. I want to thank all of you who contributed to the benefit. To date, we've raised over $1 million in support of research related to children's health and development, and I hope you have the new date on your calendar. So again, thank you to all those of you who contributed. If you'd like to attend the benefit, please visit the Parents in Science website or pick up information about it at the registration table on your way out after the program. The speaker will be Dr. Robert Lustig, a leading expert on the deleterious effects of excess sugar consumption in both children and adults. So now on to this evening's program, Illuminating Resilience, How Stress and Trauma Can Transform Us. We all respond to stress in different ways. Some of us recover rather quickly, while others of us have long-term struggles. Our featured speaker this evening, Dr. Rachel Yehuda, studies the variety of human responses following traumatic experiences. Her research suggests that there are hereditary mechanisms by which the effects of trauma may be passed from a parent to its child, thereby altering that child's ability to cope with stressful stimuli. According to Dr. Yehuda, this occurs through epigenetic changes, inherited modifications that affect gene activity without changing the genes themselves. Dr. Yehuda began to study the epigenetic components of resilience when she investigated the stress responses of children of Holocaust survivors. Many of the survivors' children encountered serious problems in dealing with stressful situations in their own lives. In fact, they had abnormally low levels of cortisol, a hormone that helps the body recover from trauma and stress. Dr. Yehuda saw similar results in children born to some women who had been pregnant during the September 11th attacks and who subsequently suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll hear more about her fascinating scientific journey this evening. Her insights into the role of genetics in our ability to deal with trauma can lead to more individualized treatment for many stress-related disorders. Dr. Yehuda is professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, where she directs the Traumatic Stress Studies Division. She also heads the PTSD clinical research program at the James J. Peters Veterans Affairs Medical Center in the Bronx. But before I welcome Dr. Yehuda to the stage, I'd also like to take this opportunity to introduce our panelists this evening, Dr. Bruce McEwen, whom we will hear from later. Bruce is the university's Alfred E. Mirsky Professor and head of the Harold and Margaret Millikan Hatch Laboratory of Neuroendocrinology. He's made key discoveries about hormones and brain development and has a special interest in the outcomes of stress and low socioeconomic status in childhood. His work has shown that hormones have profound effects on the brain and body, helping to explain variations in the stress response, as well as the long-term consequences of stressful experiences in early life. Bruce is the author of the book, The End of Stress as We Know It, and he serves as the Parents in Science faculty advisor. But now, Please join me in welcoming Rachel Yehuda to the stage.
Thank you so much. This is such a privilege and an honor to be here at Rockefeller to address you all tonight. And my topic, of course, is how stress and trauma experienced by parents transform children. And I'd like to begin by showing you a series of 5 pictures. So what can be concluded from those pictures? I think at least 2 things we all know for sure. One is that even without knowing the details or the specifics, something catastrophic happened in the lives of these people. That's the first thing we know. And the second thing we know is that it just happened. It didn't happen last month or last year. What we saw in front of us was an acute, immediate response. And we all knew it because fear, shock, helplessness, horror, grief, they are universal responses to tragedy in different languages. It doesn't matter, different cultures. That's how it looks. But we also know that those responses are relatively short-lived. So whatever the underlying biology of stress or emotions that makes those reactions occur following tragedy, we won't see them for a very, very long time. We know this. But we also know that the effects of trauma are enduring. At the same time, we know this to be true and even transformative. Now, I can't show you a series of 5 pictures that will describe that. That would be like taking pictures just outside at random, because we don't wear whatever it is that transforms us in an obvious way on our person. We keep whatever that is inside. But most people who undergo traumatic experiences not only feel that they still have some lingering effects of the experience, but they almost describe themselves as being a different person. I've heard veterans say, "I left myself on the battlefield," or rape victims say, "That Susan doesn't exist anymore." So there's something very profound about experiencing these events, and that the biology of stress, which is really focused on what happens immediately and also what recovers immediately, doesn't do the trick in addressing the issue. But this notion that effects of trauma are enduring led to the concept of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And before post-traumatic stress disorder was established as a diagnosis in 1980, there really wasn't a good concept or paradigm for describing enduring effects of stress. We just didn't really have it. In the mental health literature or in psychiatry, you know, they use the N-word to describe people who kept complaining about the effects of a stress long ago. Of course, I mean the word neurotic. But there wasn't any model that could really explain why the effects were still with us, even though the event was long past. PTSD is a condition that occurs that represents a failure to recover from the immediate effects of trauma. There are some signature symptoms: unwanted intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, startle. I'm not really going to talk about PTSD so much today, but I will say something very important about it. Not all trauma-exposed persons develop this condition. There are lots of different ways to be affected by stress and trauma and catastrophe. Not all of them result in PTSD, and not all of them result in psychiatric disorder or mental health symptoms. But in those who do develop PTSD, there can be lasting effects transmitted to the next generation. That's what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to begin by talking about it in the children of Holocaust survivors. Now you might wonder, why would anyone even think to examine this question, and why in the children of Holocaust survivors? And the answer is, well, they've been so obvious about it in the arts and the literature. They're possibly the first group, as a group of children of, with possibly the exception of children of alcoholics, that we've heard from in a way that really describes this concept that they have been affected somehow, either intergenerationally by the experience of the Holocaust or by the effects of being raised by people who experienced the Holocaust. And I had a lot of examples of this. I'll just show you a few. You can see the artistic depictions of Miri Levy, of a mother fused with a child, of Richard Horowitz, of a baby really having a choice between drowning and a vulture saving him. And of course, Art Spiegelman's Mouse. I had nightmares about SS men coming into my class and dragging all of us Jewish kids away, he says to his wife, explaining how he felt when he was growing up. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't obsessed with this stuff. It's just that sometimes I'd fantasize Zyklon B coming out of our shower instead of water. And there's lots of poetry. And I'm just going to read you one poem just to get a sense, because I don't think Graphs of Symptoms captures it at all. So this is a poem by Barbara Hyde Haber called Shielded. She's a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. You are encased in a transparent shield that lets you move and flex yourself, but not fully. You hug, but not fully. I feel you there, almost in reach, but cannot get to you fully. In truth, there is no shield, for we reside within one's skin. Your breath, when it is short, makes me gulp for air. When you cannot walk, I limp. When you gird yourself, I stiffen. I turn to me and find myself not fully there. Now, in 1993, I was at Mount Sinai. I had just been there for a couple years doing research on Holocaust survivors, and we decided to open up a clinic to treat Holocaust survivors in the community, recognizing that there was no real place for Holocaust survivors to go as a group to get treatment, but many children of Holocaust survivors called us, and we were really interested to see that their clinical complaints were really very similar to the portrayals in the art. When we asked the question that you ask, what brings you to treatment, we heard many common themes. Feelings of being different or damaged, daily intrusions of Holocaust imagery, problems separating from parents, leading to problems in interpersonal relationships, the burden for compensating for past losses, anxiety, depression, guilt. And most of the patients that we had did attribute problems to the Holocaust or being raised by survivors. We thought this was fascinating, but we also wondered how generalizable it was. It's the question that always comes up in clinical practice, or when you meet someone who tells you something, how representative is this person's experience of the universe, right? And again, are treatment-seeking people representative of their cohort? We decided to basically do some research in the literature to see what had been written about adult children of Holocaust survivors. And with the exception of a few case reports and psychoanalytic anecdotes, what we found overwhelmingly, and again, this is the early 90s, was that the academic literature, if it did anything at all, it often sought to dispute the myth of damage to the second generation. I might also say that many of the studies were written by second-generation Holocaust survivors or offspring, but it was a clear message. Survivors are resilient, their offspring are successful, and about the time that Art Spiegelman came out with Mouse, there had been another book, Against All Odds, by William Helmreich, that really described the enormous capacity of resilience in Holocaust survivors. So the basic message was that neither Holocaust survivors nor their children are any more damaged than anyone else. Sure, some people have problems. You don't have to be a Holocaust survivor or a child of Holocaust survivor to have mental illness. We certainly know that. Now, Yael Danieli, who really had a great take on this, wrote about what she thought was behind this kind of reasoning, and she wrote about this idea that long-lasting impact on Holocaust survivors or their children might give the Nazis a posthumous victory. It's enough that they took 6 million. Would they also take the living people and their generations to come? And so there was a real reluctance, she said, to really talk about the Holocaust in those terms. And again, when you study trauma, it doesn't have to be the Holocaust. You always run into this kind of politics of victimization, and it's a really fine line to tread, especially when you're talking about the Holocaust, because it is really important to document the horrors and the consequences of the Holocaust, because you have to validate the experience. But if you over-pathologize it, then what happens is that you're actually pointing to the same kind of physical scars and sequelae that were used to justify extermination of the Jews in the first place. It's a very sensitive issue. So you don't want to minimize the scars. It's tough. So I felt that there was an extraordinary opportunity of scientific inquiry right at this moment, which was to provide objective data to the question of whether there is an effect of the Holocaust on the second generation. So we began asking some very simple questions. Do offspring have more mental health problems than their peers? And we'd have to go out of the clinic sample to ask those questions, of course. Are the problems that offspring have similar to those of their parents, the survivors? And are the biologic markers in offspring similar to Holocaust survivors? When we began this research, we already had a sense that cortisol levels certainly were lower in PTSD compared to trauma survivors who did not have PTSD. This was work that we had really begun in the late 80s and early 90s. And what you can see in the green bar are Holocaust survivors and combat veterans with similar exposure. They didn't show low cortisol levels, so we already knew about that. And if you're thinking to yourself, low cortisol, I thought cortisol was a stress hormone, shouldn't levels be high? You're right, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, let me show you the results of the mental health symptoms in Holocaust offspring. What we found in this sample of about 300 people is that, yes, indeed, there was a greater prevalence of mental illness in the adult offspring of Holocaust survivors, but in a very interesting kind of pattern. If you look over to the anxiety, this is generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, or panic disorder. The risk here is just having a parent who is a Holocaust survivor. That gave you an increased risk for having a lifetime anxiety disorder. And I apologize, this bar isn't here, but this is just about 10% here, and this is about 30% here. If either your mother or your father had post-traumatic stress disorder, this elevated your risk for depression. PTSD was 3 times more common among offspring of Holocaust survivors, but the risk factor was maternal PTSD. If your mother had PTSD, or if both parents had PTSD. And when we looked at cortisol levels, and these are mean cortisol levels obtained round the clock, we put in an IV and we measure cortisol round the clock for 24 hours every half hour, and this is the mean. What you also see here is that lower cortisol levels was mostly observed in relation to maternal PTSD, a little bit in paternal PTSD, but most significantly in maternal PTSD. Interestingly, in another study, we found that there was a significant relationship between cortisol in offspring and maternal PTSD symptoms. Now, what's interesting here is that a clinician is rating maternal PTSD symptoms by evaluating the parent. The offspring's not rating the maternal PTSD symptoms here. And yet you can see a relationship. So we were very interested to ask the question, are lower cortisol levels a consequence of intergenerational transmission? And are lower cortisol levels related to increased risk for PTSD? Now, by the time we asked this question, we knew something else about cortisol and PTSD. There were several emerging studies that were showing that, in fact, cortisol levels were not only lower in people that had chronic post-traumatic stress disorder years and years after their exposure. But if you measured, like in this case, cortisol levels within hours after a motor vehicle accident, and then examined longitudinally the patients 4 months later, you found that persons with lower cortisol levels at the time of the accident were more likely to have PTSD. So maybe it was related to risk. So let me for a moment talk about what it means to be at risk for PTSD and how that all might work. So this is a slide everybody has seen many times, the World Trade Center. When I talk about offspring of Holocaust survivors being at greater risk for PTSD, I don't mean that they have PTSD to the Holocaust. They didn't experience the Holocaust. I mean that they may have a greater chance of developing PTSD when an event like this occurs in their lives. Well, who's at risk for PTSD anyway? Why do some people get the disorder while other people don't? Well, here again is a picture taken moments after the trauma where you really can't tell, because a universal response is occurring, whether or not one of these people is going to get PTSD. So what is going on with these people? Well, two things. One is that both of them are having a normal fight or flight response, but the other is that both of them are processing the information cognitively about what is occurring. So let's take the fight or flight response first. Fight or flight response is pretty simple. Information gets into the brain reacts by activating the sympathetic nervous system. It's the fight or flight response, and it results in an increase in adrenaline, which elevates your heart rate, blood pressure, glucose, causes you to be aroused. And the adrenaline and catecholamines are really important also for promoting a memory of the event. But another thing that happens is that cortisol levels are released from the adrenal glands after being stimulated by the brain and the pituitary. And cortisol also has a really important role in stress. It has many functions that relate to stress responses, but one of them is that it helps contain the fight or flight response. In other words, this idea that the stress response doesn't last forever, your heart does not beat forever, some process has to be activated to mobilize recovery, and cortisol is the hormone that is really important as part of that response. Now, risk for PTSD increases if the sympathetic nervous system arousal is sustained. If you can't come back to baseline fast enough, you are at risk for PTSD. So how would that be accomplished? Well, one way is that arousal could be perpetuated by a failed cortisol response. So if your cortisol levels are lower going in, that might compromise you a little bit. But the other thing is that arousal is perpetuated by negative thoughts. Who has time to think? Well, we all do during a traumatic event. Some of us dissociate. But there are all sorts of things we could be thinking while we are coping and dealing with an immediate event. Negative cognitions or negative thoughts are, I'm unsafe, I'm incompetent, I'm going to die, I'm being punished, I'll never make it. That kind of stuff is going to keep your adrenaline level higher. But I only have one more block to go, thank God I'm safe, I'm going to make it, it's going to be fine. That has the effect of calming down the sympathetic nervous system, and that is more associated with not developing PTSD. So now you might ask me, well, where do the negative thoughts come from? Well, from the trauma, no. You're primed already to have either positive or negative thoughts before the traumatic event occurs. And let me give you a really good illustration of this. And this is a picture drawn by Adam when he was 5 years old. His first day of kindergarten was on 9/11/2001. And Adam's parents are friends of mine. They're both therapists, but that's irrelevant. Maybe it isn't. Adam lives in Lower Manhattan and saw the first plane hit the first tower. A few hours later, he drew this picture, the smoke, the plane, the fire, the people dropping out of the building. But you know what these discs are? These are the trampolines. See, Adam heard the fire alarm, the fire trucks, and he put 2 and 2 together. And although it was horrible to see people dropping out of the sky, in his mind he knew that they were safe. So this is a positive cognitive process that has an origin somehow. Something in Adam's environment led him to know, erroneously maybe, but led him to believe that it's all going to be okay. Now, that's 5 years old. But one of the things we learned after 9/11 is that the influence on a child's response to stress may begin before birth as a result of in utero exposure to maternal stress hormones. We were able to follow a group of women who had to evacuate the World Trade Center. They had come into to the community medicine program. They were very concerned about exposure to toxins. But we also had the opportunity to monitor them throughout their pregnancy and after they gave birth. And one of the things that we saw was that pregnant women with PTSD expectedly had lower levels of cortisol compared to mothers who did not have PTSD after 9/11, but so did their babies. So did their babies. And here too, there was a relationship between PTSD in mothers and cortisol in the babies. Now here, the PTSD in the mothers is being rated by the mother, but we're measuring the cortisol in the babies. So there's a very striking correlation here. Exactly what we saw in the Holocaust offspring. As a matter of fact, if you look at this not as a correlation, but as 2 groups separated by whether your mother does or does not have PTSD, you get a relationship between maternal PTSD and infant distress following novelty, which we measured when the infant was 2 years old. And here, trait anxiety in adult offspring. This is even a bigger effect. Maybe as time goes on, the effect gets bigger and bigger. Now, why do we think it's in utero? Well, they were pregnant on 9/11, but that's not the real reason. The real reason is because we had a trimester effect. And essentially, if women were in their first trimester when exposed, there was no difference in cortisol between them and their offspring. In fact, both were low. But in the second and third trimester, we began to see a difference. And let me give you a little sense of what it is we're talking about here. We wondered whether low cortisol in offspring could originate in utero. And here is, let's say this is the placenta, and as we know, a lot of nutrients and blood supply and a lot of information crosses the placenta into the fetus. And we wonder, and in the second trimester, the enzyme 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 2 is an enzyme that begins to be active in the placenta, and this enzyme protects the fetus from the effects of maternal glucocorticoids. Now, how would an enzyme protect a fetus? Well, this is an enzyme that converts active cortisol to its inactive metabolite, cortisone. And you know, you gotta really love chemistry, because the only difference between this molecule and this molecule is this one little hydrogen, one little, tiny little atom. And of course a double bond, but that's a detail. It is just really, the parsimony involved in this is just very beautiful. But babies born to mothers under stress actually do show changes in the activity of this enzyme. And this was first documented in studies examining the effect of starvation on mothers who gave birth to babies that were that had alterations in this enzyme that were later at risk for developing hypertension and obesity. But I want to share with you this very important idea that this change, we call it developmental programming, this change in the enzyme that might have occurred as a result of exposure may not necessarily be detrimental. It really may not be, because the change in the direction of the enzyme would actually be an ideal change if the offspring was expected to be under conditions of starvation. That would be a very good metabolism to have. However, when confronted with the abundance of food in our culture, when a morning muffin is the size of a 1960s birthday cake, you know, it might be very different, right? That enzyme could lead to metabolic syndrome and other kinds of difficulties. So the change that occurs is just a change and an accommodation. It's the context that we live in that determines whether the change is good or bad. But in any event, the adult children of Holocaust offspring did show changes in this enzyme. And it's not just an in utero effect. We could find changes in developmental programming that are also associated with postnatal activities and, importantly, behavior of the mother. And we learned this, interestingly enough, we first learned it in rodents. So there's a way to develop rat mothers that show variation in maternal care. It's very interesting. You can remove the mother from the cage and handle the mother, and the mother comes back to the cage after a long, hard day at work and begins to lick and groom the pups excessively. And what we learned from this research is that mothers who show this phenotype have offspring that then show lower cortisol levels. And it's not in utero because they've done cross-fostering studies to show that this is actually the behavior of the licking and grooming that results in this phenotype. Now, this is a really important demonstration that maternal behavior can change the cortisol, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Now, when this research first came out, I think it even started here. Is it good or to lick and groom? That's good mothering, bad mothering. You know, we have to be very careful in our interpretations of what we see in a rat. Honestly, they were making mothers all over the country feel terrible for daycare and all that kind of stuff. We don't really know how rats feel about licking and grooming. To me, it sounds pretty horrific, personally. Like left alone. You know, what looks like good mothering really may be good smothering, and it's really interesting to bring this back to Holocaust offspring because many Holocaust parents really did hover over their children and probably seemed like they were playing a very active and positive role. But I know this because we gave an instrument called the Parental Bonding Inventory to Holocaust offspring, and you could see a beautiful relationship between maternal overprotection and urinary cortisol excretion. Guess what? No such relationship exists between cortisol and offspring and paternal overprotection. Okay, so am I saying that fathers are unimportant to intergenerational transmission or cortisol or risk? No, I would never say that. Even if it were true, I would never say that. But it doesn't happen to be true. Fathers and mothers really have different contributions. Fathers can pass things epigenetically through their germ cells, their sex cells, whereas mothers pass them through in utero as well. And both may pass epigenetic changes through their behaviors. So for a really good example in males, male rodents again, is that socially defeated males, we can make a male socially defeated by exposing him to a cat, beating him up a few times. There's all sorts of human things we can learn from rats. They give birth to male offspring that are also socially defeated. So the point is that postnatal parental effects, whether maternal or paternal, they can be mediated through epigenetic changes. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that is. An epigenetic change is a chemical change that alters the way the gene behaves. And it's a really important mechanism because the effects of this epigenetic change are potentially enduring. They may, some epigenetic effects may be more transient than we thought, but this is a way to have kind of an immediate correction or adaptation in one generation without waiting for natural selection to kind of give you what you need. You can really change things right away if you feel you need to. And changes in maternal care in the rats that I just showed you did in fact lead to an epigenetic change in the brain glucocorticoid or cortisol receptor gene. And so we wanted to really examine this. The epigenetic change that was observed was a change in gene methylation. So I want to just give you a tiny little visual about this because otherwise it may be too esoteric, but the beauty of chemistry and molecular biology is that these things can become very tangible. So of course we learned from the Rockefeller University that a gene is simply a segment of DNA, right? Whoops. And basically DNA has two jobs to do. It needs to replicate itself through DNA synthesis, or it needs to be transcribed into RNA so it can execute its recipe. The gene is a blueprint for who we are. Genes make RNA, and RNA make proteins, and basically it is the recipe for us. So how does this work? The RNA is synthesized as an analog of the DNA, not quite an exact replica, never mind, but basically the RNA looks at the hydrogen bond strand and then creates an analog of itself, and then that is the first step towards making a protein, right? Now, how many people here have ever tried to cook from a recipe book and come up with a product that looks nothing like the picture? Well, that happens in our bodies too, right? So it can happen, and that's a long story, that molecules, for example, this is a methyl group with a carbon and 3 hydrogens, are in the environment because of the conformation of the DNA, and this molecule can attach itself onto one of the bases, cytosine, and when it does so, this interferes with the synthesis of the RNA, because the RNA just doesn't recognize this molecule in the same way. It can result in changes in the recipe, gene silencing, etc. Now, you can actually measure this. You can look at a region of in this case, the glucocorticoid receptor that you think has the transcription factor that is responsible for the good action of the gene. And you can look at these little CPG islands, and you can just ask the question, are there methyl groups there? And that would be evidence that there is an epigenetic change. Now, decreased methylation in the case of this particular gene would be associated with PTSD and PTSD risk and low cortisol, or more specifically, increased glucocorticoid receptor activity. So we did this in Holocaust offspring. We measured the percent methylation in that little region of the gene in offspring. We just completed this study, and we actually found that the percent methylation was lower in relation to maternal PTSD, but not paternal PTSD. It's just one little region of one little gene, but you got to start somewhere, and it's tangible. So now, let me wrap up. What does this mean for you and your child, right? How do epigenetic changes help us understand the vulnerability that we see in offspring of parents or mothers who are exposed to trauma? Well, what happens is something like this. A biologic change that may originate as early as in utero that creates the opportunity for greater change of responses to the environment can occur. And that's the developmental programming, and I gave you the example of that enzyme 11 hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. And really, if your enzyme activity is different, this changes everything. This changes your entire stress metabolism. Even though it looks like one little thing is happening, the implications are gigantic, and depending on the context, this will play out in very different ways. During the early postnatal period, there's more opportunity to lay the groundwork for risk because attachment may be disrupted. Now, this is the maternal behavior piece. And this is what you really have to realize. A trauma survivor who's continuing to have symptoms that started in pregnancy and now continues postpartum they may have a really hard time engaging in normal attachments because of past intrusions, which are highly disruptive. And in the case of Holocaust survivors, there were lots of problems. They may have difficulty letting go and allowing the child to have the autonomy they need. Fear of loss may make the parent reluctant to love fully and engage fully. Normal patterns of maternal care are certainly disrupted by a preoccupied mother. And then there's a phenomenon that continues later when the child grows up, that when the child becomes the age the parent was when traumatized, there's even more disruption. The parent can really shut down, and that's why childhood traumatization is a particularly devastating has particularly devastating effects on children, on the children of mothers who were exposed in childhood for this reason, because mothers almost associate because the child really brings them back to that time in their lives. And what has to happen, what does happen, is that the child responds through a biological accommodation or adaptation. Attachment calls for a biologic response. And there is a reciprocal dialogue between the mother and child from really a biologic perspective as well as a psychological one. And it really takes, because the stress response system is organizing in response to an environmental demand. And the caregiver is placing a great demand on the child because of the disrupted attachment. Now, what then happens? The biologic accommodation occurs, and it may or may not be a mismatch for the environment that the adult experiences, and that leaves them vulnerable. And I had a patient who said it as well as I could ever say it to you in one of our groups for second-generation Holocaust survivors. She said, "My mother raised me perfectly for Auschwitz, but I live on the Upper West Side." And that's it in a nutshell. Now, if the child can accommodate again as an adult, the effects will not be further transmitted to the third generation. If the environment can alter biology so profoundly, this is actually a very powerful message of resilience, because if negative effects change biology, positive effects change biology too. It's really in the hands of the beholder, which is the parents. The message that parenting matters is really the strongest message that I can offer you. Just because we learn it from the negative doesn't mean that it doesn't apply to the positive. And this is my team, mostly women, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel, for this fascinating lecture. I'd now like to invite Bruce to join the two of us, and we'll move over to the table here. So perhaps I could start by asking the two of you a few questions before we open it to the conversation to the audience. And Rachel, I think you started, we're going in that direction towards the end of your talk. You focused a lot initially on traumatic stress, but I'm sure that many of the parents in the audience here are thinking, well, I have a very busy and demanding life that's often very stressful. Have I passed this along, this high stress to my children, and at what cost? Is this a reasonable concern?
I have it. I think we all have it. There's no perfect answer for that. I think we all really worry about it. But I think the best thing to do is not actually worry so much, but just act. I think that the message of all this work is that being present in a consistent way and without ambivalence is probably going to be the best way to develop resilience. The overcompensating, the overlicking and grooming because you weren't there that day is probably more harmful than just a set of consistent reality that the child can accommodate to.
So consistency.
I think so.
So then at a practical level, and if you think about sheltering children from stress, in childhood versus exposing them with the hope that they'll be better equipped to deal with stress. How do you strike the balance?
Oh, I would err on the side of exposing. I think that I think part of why PTSD has entered the conversation the way that it has in society is because we are so ill-equipped in general to deal with adversity, because maybe we don't have enough in small doses. So it's like everything else. If you have to cope with things in smaller doses earlier on, then you build a muscle for it so that maybe you can cope with bigger challenges later on. But if you really protect somebody too much when they're younger, thinking, oh, they'll have plenty of time to suffer when they're older, they may not have developed the machinery to deal with things. And even when a baby cries, and we have these monitors that blast in our ear for every little whimper, and we run in there. Before those monitors, we may have not heard the baby for a little while, and the baby would maybe figure out how to self-soothe a little bit. So there's a whole field of stress inoculation that has shown that in monkeys and also in people, a little bit of exposure to stress can have a very profound inoculating effect and really build resilience.
I think this ties into a theme that Bruce has studied a lot, which is the beneficial effects of moderate stress. Could you tell us about your work?
Well, just following on what Rachel just said, we've been involved in collaborative studies on a rodent model which perfectly supports the notion of consistency and limited exposure to novelty. In other words, you have a consistent mother. It doesn't matter how good she is, as long as she's consistent over time, and that fits. And if you expose the animals to limited amounts of novelty under controlled conditions, their later cognitive and social development is much, much better. And it turns out that the offspring themselves develop better self-stress, self-regulation, because one of the hallmarks of a successful stress response is that you turn it on when you need it, you turn on that adrenaline and cortisol when you need it, and you turn it off when it's no longer necessary. So it's a matter of turning it on as well as turning it off. And it turns out the best mothers, the most consistent mothers in this rodent model, are the ones that have good stress self-regulation. And their offspring also develop good stress self-regulation. But the key is the limited exposure to novelty. So one can translate that into human terms, not hovering, but letting things happen and letting the child, but then providing consistent background of support. So the rodent models that we work with are perfectly supporting what you're just saying.
So we're hearing a consistent message here of consistency in dealing with stress.
Right.
Yeah. Bruce, I think also the audience might be interested in hearing a bit about your studies on the effects of chronic stress and low socioeconomic status in childhood.
Right. Well, this is not something that we do in the laboratory, where we do animal models, and we're studying basic molecular and cellular mechanisms by which the brain responds to stress. And the bottom line there is that the architecture of the brain is altered by both acute and chronic stress. In fact, areas of the brain that are involved in anxiety, like the amygdala, which is an area of fear and anxiety, actually grow and become larger and more active under these conditions. And we actually have a study that, again, fits with the study that I think you were co-author on, showing that a rat exposed to trauma develops 10 days later a PTSD-like condition of increased anxiety. This is with a collaborator in Bangalore, India. And the neurons on these amygdala, the neurons in the amygdala, develop more synaptic connections, which sort of subserves the greater anxiety. But if you apply cortisol, the glucocorticoid, at the time of trauma, either by giving it to the animal or giving the animal a tiny stressor, it prevents the development of this. In other words, it prevents, and your study on traffic accident victims who come in and are given cortisol right after a traffic accident have less likelihood of developing PTSD, shows that cortisol is actually a good guy. So that gets back to your basic question, which is we think of it in a bad sense because we often think that when cortisol goes up, it's under conditions of bad stress, but it's there to protect us, to help us adapt. And it actually turns out it does many interesting things that actually help the brain and body adapt. One of them that goes back to a previous Ph.D. thesis here by Firdos Dabar is that when cortisol goes up in the initial phases of a stressor, it actually enhances immune defenses, promotes the migration of immune cells to places where they're going to defend against a pathogen or repair a wound. Rachel mentioned the fact that that same surge of cortisol actually helps the animal or the person remember better conditions to avoid danger in the future. So it has many, many, many positive effects that, such as this protection of PTSD as well.
Right. So protective effect of cortisol, and again, tying into low cortisol being really quite deleterious. Right. I want to open up for questions from the audience, but I seeing the images that you showed a number of times, the dramatic images of 9/11, the tower in flames. I wonder, given your experience following 9/11, what did you expect that the long-term effects might be across populations, say across the population of New York City as a whole, and more than a decade later, do you think that your expectations were correct? What have you seen that surprised you, if anything?
Yeah, I was called by the New York Times really half an hour after the first plane hit the tower. And I was asked whether I thought there would be an epidemic of PTSD in New York, and I said no. I didn't think that. I thought we'd be resilient. I thought that there would be certain people that would be particularly at risk, people who were directly affected, people who lost loved ones. Even they would recover with time. But the people who are most vulnerable when these things happen are the people who've already been vulnerable in the past, people who already struggled with mental health problems, who had already been traumatized. For them, this recreated and re-erupted feelings of vulnerability. And we knew that this would happen. And so the people that you really have to watch out for when adversity happens is people that you know have already had adversity. Because they're going to have an initial reaction. Now the good news is that if you deal with it, then this can have a very positive and quick recovery. But you have to understand it first, because what was happening in many mental health clinics in New York is that people weren't understanding why people were coming in who were not directly exposed. I saw it on TV and I'm very upset. And people would say, well, that's not upsetting. But what they didn't know was that 2 years earlier, there had been a fire in their apartment that tore down one of the floors and it resulted in a loss of life to someone else. I mean, they didn't know the backstory, and they didn't know that this was just a precipitating event that brought back a lot of traumatic memories. So when people say, I feel very traumatized by something, even if you don't understand what the event is that they're reacting to on the surface, what you need to know is that there's probably a collection of events in the past, and that this is a sensitization. They're having an exaggerated response.
The CDC a number of years ago did a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, showing that children who have adverse experiences, parental discord, economic problems, substance abuse, physical and sexual abuse, various things like that, that if they have a lot more than, say, several of these events, there's an almost exponential rise in the later occurrence of depression, vulnerability to PTSD, substance abuse, antisocial behavior, but also physical symptoms like obesity, cardiovascular disease, and so on. And this is a very famous and important study because it was carried out in the Kaiser Permanente health system in California. This is not a problem of lower SES only. It's a problem in the middle class. It's something that's all around us, all across many cultures. And it's something to be kept in mind, which is sort of basically what you were getting at.
Perfect. Well, I think we'll open it to questions now. There are some roving microphones. We'll ask you to wait for the microphone so that everybody can hear the question. I see a question over here on the right.
If you are a person who has a low level of cortisol, are there things you can do to improve your resilience? Or increase cortisol?
Wow. So I've shown you low cortisol, but I didn't show you all of the biology and molecular biology that is behind low cortisol. So low cortisol is not necessarily a negative thing. It really depends on a whole set of other factors about how your body is responding. I think that if you think you have low cortisol, meaning that if you think that you're vulnerable, what you have to do is you have to ramp up the aftercare for when stressful and traumatic events occur. I mean, what do you think is happening in the military? They want to be able to identify who's at risk. Are they not going to take them into the military? No. Are they going to stop war? No. What are they going to do? They're going to try to offer immediate interventions that are designed to really do more than nature would do to help somebody deal with the stress. So what your question is really about is that if I feel a little more fragile, what should I do? What you should do is recognize that you need to do more for yourself when you are feeling stressed and not ignore it. Because I think many of us do tend to ignore that feeling of being overwhelmed. And maybe the answer is to really stop and reflect on it a little bit, and then say that what I tried to show you was that positive cognition, saying the right thing, can be very effective in changing your internal biology, and maybe that is the kind of thing that we want to do. If I thought I really had low cortisol, meaning vulnerability to stress, I'd spend like 10 minutes talking myself down from the ledge. Oh, that's a negative cognition. Be thankful. That is a very positive thing to do. That being said, Bruce mentioned that we are doing a study where we are looking to see whether administering a very high dose of cortisol in the emergency room will prevent PTSD. We're having some success with that. But I think that the real answer is learn how to talk to your body in a way to develop the skills that you need to be able to cope with your environment.
We have a question at the back there.
If we're kind of stuck with our epigenetics that we get either from our mother or father, which may predispose us towards this, and we can change the cognitive, could you speak about the use of mindfulness or mindfulness-based stress reduction in terms of breaking, the vicious cycle of the negative, cognitive thoughts, accelerating the PTSD, symptoms, as in the article in Nature Neuroscience that you had with Dr. Davidson?
I think that there is a whole new view developing of the possibilities of plasticity in the brain that can be facilitated by mindfulness-based meditation, mindfulness of various kinds, and meditation practices, as well as by cognitive behavioral therapies of other types, as long as there is also a way of perhaps facilitating that plasticity. One of the ways of doing it is becoming physically active, which actually increases the trophic factors in your brain and your body that actually help it change, and combine that with some of these therapies. So the old notion that the brain was stuck and not able to change after birth is beginning to give way to a new view that there are possibilities that we can exploit.
Do you think that that would change the epigenetic profile of the individual, not the offspring?
Very possibly, because I think Rachel mentioned methylation of these cytosine residues in DNA. There are also changes at the level of the histones. In fact, a lot of this work began here with the work of Alfrey and Mirsky. I was actually a student of theirs, and this whole idea that this complex of proteins and enzymes is regulating the unfolding of DNA or the bunching up of DNA so it can't be read, and methylation of the cytosine residues is one of these. But it turns out that methylation is not necessarily an irreversible process. In fact, in the studies that Rachel mentioned of maternal care, it turns out that the infant brain, this glucocorticoid receptor promoter, is heavily methylated at birth. And what the maternal care does is cause a demethylation of this promoter so that more of these receptors can be produced. And these receptors, by and large, for the glucocorticoids, have beneficial adaptive effects, as we were talking about earlier. So that's one example of the plasticity, shall we say, of that particular system. And I think that is our increasing awareness of the fact that there are other ways of changing these epigenetic signatures.
I also think methylation changes in adults. This is all new stuff, but we are probably one of the few groups that are doing longitudinal studies on this. And even though the theory is that this is very, very stable and enduring, in reality, maybe it's relatively stable and enduring relative to other kind of biologic changes, but I think that there is room for biologic accommodation. I think that if we didn't believe that, things like psychotherapy would be pointless. I think that the whole idea of why we encourage people with mental health problems to talk and to have interventions and to reflect on it is because we believe that these kind of environmental changes really do make a difference. We have to believe that they do, and I think that there's now the evidence to support that they do. Exactly on what molecular level is something that we're going to be sorting out in the next few years, but the basic idea is that if a bad event can have an effect, a good event can have an effect. It cuts both ways.
A question here?
We all know there are people who are considered to be positive types and people who are just negative thinkers. Have there been any studies done to show that there is a real correlation between positive thinkers and high cortisol and vice versa?
I don't know.
I'm not aware of any. I mean, it's an interesting question. And yeah, of course, it depends. The conditions under which you measure the cortisol are very important. And I think it's a very labile substance that goes up and down with experiences. But I think the general notion that I mentioned earlier of being able to turn it on when needed and turn it off when needed and not having high levels of cortisol all the time. For example, if we have a circadian rhythm, and a circadian rhythm going up, rising before we wake up in the morning, rising a bit around lunchtime, going down in the evening, if that rhythm is flat, it's bad news. It's associated with metabolic syndrome, with depression, certain kinds of depression, and so on. So having a very effective diurnal rhythm is important actually also for turning on and turning off efficient cortisol responses. So we have to bear that in mind if we're going to ask questions about positive thinking and so on. We would suspect that people with a positive outlook would have more efficient regulation, but I can't cite a specific study.
Thank you. We have a question in the back there.
The main takeaway that I'm getting is probably based on the fact that I'm a family therapist. Parenting matters, and I was interested that that Dr. Yehuda said that one of the main things you can do sort of as a parent actually is to learn how to talk yourself off the ledge in order to calm any reactivity that you have before interacting with your child. Of course, we all know that that is really hard to do 100% of the time. But you said some other things that are familiar to me in terms of being a family therapist, and one of those things is that parents who have been traumatized as children see in their own children when they're arriving, say a mother sees a daughter arriving at the age when she was raped, for example, and the reactivity will increase, and we see that a lot without seeing this wonderful explanation of the chemistry underneath that. And it just, if anyone is looking for ways of helping with that, one of the places to go, I think, is the Ackerman Institute for the Family, if there is, because sometimes it seems that we don't always know how to do these things, even though they sound very practical. And I wanted to know if you were familiar with the work of Dr. Sue Johnson in couples work. She works with an attachment frame. Okay, well, it's relevant. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll take a question back there.
It's probably beyond the scope of your studies, but if you think of multi-generational war-torn countries, where each generation creates more impulsive, intolerant of frustration, violent and aggressive adolescents and children, and you associate it with economic factors like in Egypt or in Africa or in the Middle East. I mean, think about the implications of this in terms of what kind of children we're creating, what kind of adults they become, and how sophisticated a governmental system they can endure with those issues.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I do think about this a lot, actually, because we are now studying third generation, and one of the things that I've seen in the third generation is that it's not as bad as I thought. And I think that the reason for that is that the second generation was so on top of identifying a problem, and also the first generation turned out they're pretty good grandparents. And they somehow also could regroup around, maybe the time also, around this need to kind of really think about this and consider the implications of all of it. But you're right, if you just have cultures where you go generation to generation and you continue to transmit the legacy of trauma, then you will get a more rigid product. And I gave a talk in a Native American historical trauma day, and it was very interesting to really see how cultures struggle with wanting to keep these kinds of things alive while they know that they're not necessarily so good for you. So there's got to be a way to retain some kind of an ancestral memory, but not fully, but to also be able to overwrite it and analyze it. Absolutely.
In closing, I'd like to thank our speaker and our panelists again. Thanks so much.